Just a few short years ago, a tall, middle-aged man named Nathan Wyndham moved to the outskirts of the small northern town of Lichfield, Connecticut, looking to escape the busy urban life of his past 15 years. He found a quaint, reasonably priced home and the end of a cul-de-sac with a majestic historic windmill sitting right in the middle of the roundabout. He imagined spending the rest of his days sipping coffee on his front balcony and watching the slow-turning windmill blades guide his consciousness into tranquil, heavy-eyed bliss. But shortly after moving in, he found his peace being frequently interrupted by the young children of the neighborhood. It wasn't totally unexpected. The realtor mentioned children being the reason the place he was buying had experienced an unusually high turnover, but he couldn't imagine how bad neighborhood kids would have to be to make him consider moving. And although they did interrupt his peace with the occasional loud shout or ball bouncing, he didn't experience anything even worthy of mentioning, let alone moving over. That was until the day he met her, the little girl in the fluffy white dress. His first time meeting her seemed innocent enough. It was later in the afternoon on a beautiful cloudless day. He glanced out his kitchen window and saw the movement of a fluffy white dress at the edge of his backyard fence, beside the old shed. "Excuse me," he said loudly, as he stepped out the screen door of his back porch, but the puff of white with little pink shoes poking out didn't respond. "Excuse me," he shouted again, walking towards her. He could tell it was a little girl. He could see her blonde hair now from this angle. What is she doing? He thought as he stepped closer. She was on all fours, and as he flanked her, he got the impression she was digging at the base of the shed. In that nice white dress, he thought as he got closer. Her parents are going to be very upset. "Excuse me," he said a third time, not needing to shout because he was now just a few feet from her. She turned, sprung up and faced him. She just stared at him, head cocked with a confused look, as if she was trying to figure out who he was. "What are you doing here?" Nathan asked, cocking his head to match hers. "Excuse me, mister," she said politely. "Have you seen a fluffy brown jacket?" "I lost mine and can't find it." "Jacket," Nathan said, glancing around to see if any adults were in the vicinity. It was an unseasonably hot day for September, and she was already wearing a heavy, fluffy dress that looked more than adequate for the current temperature. She was an adorably cute little girl, like one you would see in studio portrait images, carelessly blowing dandelions on a blue summer day. "No, honey. No. Do you live around here?" he asked, glancing back and forth again. "This is my backyard. You should probably get home," he explained, hoping to move her along. Without another word, she turned and darted around the shed towards the back gate leading to the forest. "No!" Nathan shouted, thinking the woods was obviously the wrong direction, but no sooner than she exited the fence, she was gone. He scratched his head, glancing back and forth through the trees, but no sign of her. Turtling his head into his neck with his eyes wide like when smoke gets in them, he turned back toward his house. She'll be fine, he thought. She seemed to know where she was going. Giving the fence and tree line one last glance, he stepped back into his house, still feeling uneasy about that strange encounter. But after a few days he forgot all about it. That was until again. One bright blue afternoon, he again glanced out his kitchen window, seeing the same little blonde girl in the same white dress slipping out of his shed and sliding around back. Thumbing his eye, as if to intercept the onset of a headache, and sighing to himself, he once again fumbled out the back door to the old shed. "Excuse me," he said again. Immediately she sprang up and darted around the shed like a burglar who had just been caught red-handed. Instinctively he gave chase, although he had no idea why, but no sooner did he come around the corner, he came to a complete stop. There the little girl was standing squarely in front of him, facing him directly, as if she had been waiting for his arrival. The contrast of her flight, and now sudden still stance that almost seemed confrontational, made him freeze like a spotted prey animal. But quickly, he shook off the neurotic impulse and stepped towards her. "Can I help you?" he asked, ducking his head towards her with a tilt. She didn't respond. She just stood there staring. "Honey," he began, taking another step but didn't know what else to say. Maybe she's scared, he thought, "Sweetie, what's your name?" he said, placing his hands on his knees and leaning over empathetically. "Hannah," she replied, with the sweetest little voice. "Hannah, this is my backyard," he explained kindly but firmly. "You can't play back here. Where do you live, honey?" "Excuse me, mister," she said politely. "Have you seen a fluffy brown jacket? I lost mine and can't find it." Again with the jacket, he thought, and wearing the same dress. He wondered if the poor girl might not have a slight autism. Her question was identical to the last time they met. "No," he said. "Sweetie, your jacket isn't back here. Where do you live?" Again in a blink she was off, darting like a cat through the shed door that was open just wide enough for her small body to fit through. "No, sweetie," he said, dangling his head back and glancing at the sky in frustration. Forward he marched and swung open the shed door. "Honey, you can't be in here. It's not safe. Your parents are going to be upset," he explained in a frustrated, stern voice. But there was no answer. He glanced around. There was a few tables in the old shed, but nothing on them, and underneath them was bare as well. He had not gotten around to putting anything in the old shed yet, so it was still quite bare with little to hide behind. Nathan ducked and bobbed, spun around, and even glanced at the ceiling. "Hello," he called in utter confusion. He glanced back at the door. Could she have slipped out without his seeing? He looked for maybe a hole in the back side. "Hannah," he called out, but there was silence. He stood in the center of the shed with a scowl of aggravated confusion. He listened. Silence. No pitter-patter of a scurrying little girl. Nothing outside. Just silence. He took one more glance around and stumbled out the shed, feeling oddly defeated. The feeling mixed with a sense that something was off, leaving him puzzled and aggravated. He pulled the door tight behind him and latched it shut, in defiance of any further shenanigans. He then slunk back into his house, feeling a bit resentful of the whole backyard in general. For the rest of the day into the evening, he continually glanced out his back windows whenever he would pass them, keeping a watchful eye out for any out-of-place movement or uninvited children. But all was quiet. That was until that night. A deafening crack split the air, causing Nathan to spring from his sleep, like a catapult released at the waist. "What was that?" his mind shouted. He strained his eyes, peering into the dark. It sounded like a gunshot. He sprung to the floor and listened intently, but no sound could be heard. Nothing. He shuffled over to the window to peek outside. "What the?" he mumbles under his breath. The shed door was wide open, and the light was on. The shed door was moving back and forth as if waving him outside. He yanked his robe belt tight and darted down the stairs. As he passed through his house on his way to the backyard, he glanced around and noticed the furniture was all wrong. "What the?" he thought as he shuffled past, heading out the back door. The wind was the first to greet him outside, shoving him around like an unseen bully. He angled his head towards the shed, determined to wrangle the hyperactive swinging door that danced back and forth like dog off its leash. But just as he stepped off the deck, he screeched to a halt. One more step, and he would have been swimming. There in the middle of the yard was an in-ground swimming pool right in front of him. It could have been easily overlooked in the black darkness and blowing wind, but there it was. "Oh my God!" he exclaimed, squinting his eyes and circling around it. He suddenly noticed he was standing on a concrete deck. He strafed around the side, imploring his eyes to adjust to his current predicament. Wait, there was something on the concrete. It was blood. He knew it, in a splattered, smeared configuration leading directly toward the pool. He squinted. There was something floating in the pool. He stepped closer. It was fuzzy and brown. For a split second, his mind went to the little girl's jacket. But no sooner the thought entered his head, the shape in the pool began thrashing about. The sudden, panicked movement nearly startled him off his feet, and the sound of the water thrashing as the figure flailed desperately nearly caused him to flee. He saw the antlers. A deer, he thought, frozen in place. A deafening crack popped his ears, causing his head to duck in a flinch. A gunshot, he thought. He glanced back and forth desperately, trying to place the source of the sound. The creature in the water began to howl in terror. It looked as if it was struggling to stay above water. Nathan stepped towards the edge of the pool, squinting with all he could. As if by sheer will, he could force his eyes to see through the black water shimmering in the light coming from the shed. There is something else in the water, Nathan thought, though he couldn't tell why he thought that. But his certainty that there was something down there pulling the screaming buck below was so strong he froze, hoping not to draw its attention to him. Flailing and bucking and bellowing the most horrible sound, the buck managed to turn towards Nathan, and he could see its eye glistening in the light in absolute terror, begging him with each bellow to intervene in his impending demise. At once, Nathan sprung from his sleep. A moment of relief swept over him, as he realized it was just a dream. But just as the relief was about to settle in, a terrible loud crack could be heard just outside his window. Slowly he crawled out of bed and crept towards the window in fear. The shed was wide open. The light was on, and the door was again waving him outside. But this time, the door slapped the side of the shed, revealing that the loud bang was just the wind slapping the door against the shed's wooden side. His teeth clenched in anticipation as his eyes scanned the backyard. There was no pool, no concrete deck. He breathed a sigh of relief, girded his robe again, and dashed down the stairs out the door. First thing tomorrow, he thought. I'm buying the biggest locks I can find and locking down this nonsense for good. But the locks did little to stop the disturbances. In fact, the locks seemed to have made things worse. For that day forward, he would not get another uninterrupted night of sleep. Each night he would awake to some strange noise. One night it was voices outside, but no one could be found. One night it was footsteps downstairs, but again a still empty house was all he found. Nevertheless, Nathan began keeping his flashlight next to his bed alongside his 9mm Sig Sauer. But each time he would get up to investigate, no one was seen, and nothing was out of place. Fucking house is haunted, he muttered to himself as he crawled back into bed. But the comment was only a joke, for he fully expected to one night find neighborhood kids out after curfew, sneaking around mischievously for a thrill. He had done just that kind of thing when he was young, and the realtor had mentioned problems with the neighborhood kids. Although she hadn't been specific. Still, in the calm of the night, and sometimes even in the day, he felt something off. Something that just didn't feel right. Something he couldn't put his finger on. And something that did not feel like children. And then once again, one clear blue day, as he rinsed a lunch dish at his sink, he heard the faint sound of weeping. He listened closely. After a couple weeks of investigating strange noises that turned out to be nothing, he now waited to be sure. Yes, it was definitely crying. He followed the sound. It was coming from outside. He opened the door and peeked his head out. There was his little friend, the little blonde-haired girl, sitting on the deck stairs with her back towards him, sobbing. "Hannah!" Nathan called, stepping out on the porch. He glanced around in disbelief. How did she get in here? He thought. His backyard had been completely locked up. The tall privacy fence was quite difficult to scale, and the 3 wooden gates had giant padlocks locked from the inside. He stepped closer. "Hannah? Hannah, honey, what's the matter?" He stepped off the porch and crouched down in front of her. She was soaked from head to toe. And not only was she soaked, she was covered in mud, as if she had been rolling around in it. Her pretty white dress was matted and severely wrinkled. "Honey, what's wrong?" he repeated, attempting to calm her pitiful weeping. "Excuse me, mister," she sputtered out in between sobbing heaves. "Have you seen—" She heaved in between breaths. "A fluffy, brown jacket. I lost mine and can't find it. I can't find it." She trailed off, launching into another round of uncontrollable wailing. For some reason he couldn't understand the exact wording. Now the third time, sent chills up his spine, as if he was caught in a woeful, unbreakable loop of déjà vu. But concern for the poor little girl outweighed his unease, and he reached out to comfort her. But just as he was about to speak, The loud ring of his doorbell crashed through the awkward situation, interrupting his train of thought. He considered ignoring it, opening his mouth once more to speak, but for a second time, the doorbell rudely interrupted his intention to calm the girl. "Hannah, sweetie, 1 second, Nathan promised with a finger raised. "I'll be right back, honey. Don't go anywhere." And with that, he sprung up and back into the house, intent on intercepting the visitor, before the loud, obnoxious bell was rung a third time. "Can I help you?" Nathan pronounced accusingly, as he jutted his head out the screen door. It was a young man dressed in a blue collar button-up with a clipboard in his hand. "Yes, sir. How are you doing today, sir?" he asked with a forced smile. "I'm from True Blue Pools, and I was wondering if you would be needing your pool service this year, or if you have that covered." Nathan stood there staring at him, trying to make sense of his question. "I don't have a pool," Nathan responded with a look of confusion. His look was matched by the young man, whose eyes quickly returned to his clipboard to check his information. "Well, according to our records, you do. Is this 4437 Willow Hill?" he asked, looking back down at his notes. "Yes," Nathan spat back, wanting to end this as quick as possible. "I just moved in a few months ago." Still a blank look for the young man. "I don't have a pool," Nathan assured again. "Well, according to my records, we put a pool in about 6 years ago," the young man returned. "It was a—" He tilted his head, picking his words carefully. "It was a in-ground deluxe, Roman style," he replied, feeling assured his information was good. Nathan shot him a confused grimace. He didn't have time for this. "Nope, sorry, no pool," he replied as he shut the door. "No thanks," he added, trailing off as he headed back. How odd, he thought, as he marched through the house towards his little blonde friend. But although his interaction with the pool guy was only a couple minutes long, Hannah had once again disappeared. Where could she have gone, he wondered, as he did a round in his backyard checking all his locks. They were all secured. Could she have climbed the fence? He asked himself, scratching his head. His gaze went to the flat center of his yard. He walked over to it, staring curiously at the ground. Pool, he thought. His mind went back to that horrid dream. He kicked and stomped at the ground half-heartedly. The dirt felt a little squishy, he thought, and for a brief moment he feared sinking into the ground. "Ah!" he spit, resenting all the oddity that had been thrust upon him lately. He shuffled back in the house, resolved to never thinking about it again. "I should get curtains and never come back out here," he thought bitterly. The sound was so loud it could have come from the very room he was in. Nathan sprung up in his bed like a human jack-in-the-box. He listened. Silence. This reminded him of the terrible dream of the pool. He glanced around, making sure all was as expected, and he wasn't currently dreaming. The sound went again, but this time it was muffled by distance and intensity. He sprung to the window. His stomach sunk. His shed door was wide open, and the light was on. Went the shed door against the side again. He took a breath, gathering his will to go out there. But just as he was about to turn from the window, his eyes caught a glimpse of movement in the small side window. The black silhouette of a person standing inside the shed could be seen peering out the window. Nathan glanced over at his nightstand, checking to make sure his 9mm Sig Sauer was there and ready. He glanced back at the shed, and then nearly fell backwards at the sight. It was the unmistakable figure of a man, now standing directly in the doorway, fully squared in his direction, and although he couldn't see the eyes, he somehow knew for sure the figure was staring directly at him. "What the fuck?" Nathan cursed and stumbled back towards his gun. He scooped it up with his right hand and fumbled his phone with his left. Immediately, his thumb stumbled in a panic 911, and he waited for what felt like an eternity for someone to answer. 911, what's your emergency?" The dispatch woman answered with a casualty that infuriated him. "Yes, I have an intruder at my house," Nathan answered, making his way back to the window. He somewhat expected the figure to be gone, as if the presence of his gun and the 911 dispatcher would have somehow scared him off. He even kind of hoped he had imagined the figure, and this could all just be his mind playing tricks on him. But to his terror, the figure still stood. Still stared, even when he turned on his room light, making Nathan fear that nothing was going to make this intruder retreat. "Is the intruder in your home, sir?" the dispatch woman asked. "I'm at 4437 Willow Hill," Nathan answered with heavy breaths. "Sir, is the intruder in your home?" the dispatch woman asked again. No. He's outside in my yard, in my shed." Nathan spit back. "Sir, we're sending a unit. Please stay inside until—" Nathan cut her off, shoving his phone into his pocket, knowing help was on the way. He made it down the stairs, tracing the walls like he had seen in countless movies of authorities advancing in potentially hostile places. He made his way downstairs and struggled to keep from screaming. The house floor was covered in muddy footprints that led back and forth through the house. It was so covered with footprints, you would have thought you were at a construction site. The inside door leading into the garage was wide open. He pointed his gun ready to fire at anything that moved. The garage light was on, and the garage floor was covered in mud. There was a shovel laying in front of the garage door leading to the backyard, and the door was cracked an inch. Nathan imagined it swinging open with an axe-wielding psychopath ready to kill. With haste, he pulled it shut and locked the door, not daring to venture out where the figure was seen. He then made his way back to the back door leading onto the porch to check again and make sure it was locked, all the while ready in case someone was still in the house. Then he retreated back to the front door and set up defensively, planning to wait for the cops before venturing any further. For what seemed like an eternity, he waited. Finally, there was a ring at the door. Opening it swiftly, he was greeted by 2 officers, and at last he breathed a sigh of relief. He immediately led the police to the backyard, where the figure was spotted. But of course he was gone. The shed lock was also completely missing, along with the 3 other fence gate locks. The officers then did a thorough sweep of the house before returning to talk with Nathan. "Well, sir, it appears no one is here. We will write this up. There is nothing else we can do. Just keep your doors locked and call us if you see anything." "Are you going to dust for prints?" Nathan asked, expecting a full investigation. "Are you missing anything?" the officer asked. Nathan glanced around. "Not that I know of," he responded. "Do you have any reason to suspect he was in the house?" The officer returned. Nathan scoff laughed, thinking the question was ridiculous, but to his absolute astonishment, he glanced around, and the muddy footprints were gone. He did a double take, and even did a short lap of the house before looking at the officers in astonishment, not knowing what to say. "Sir?" the officer asked again with a puzzled look. Nathan scoffed defensively, as if this was preposterous. "The shovel," he exclaimed. He ran and grabbed it, and brought it back, handing it to them as if he just handed them the missing link to Jimmy Hoffa's location. "That's not mine," he stated confidently, seeing their confusion. "So they didn't take anything? They just left a shovel?" the officer asked with a grimace of incredulity. Nathan was smart enough to know this was going nowhere. There wasn't going to be any further investigation. "It's okay," he said, defeated. "No, it doesn't look as if anything was taken." "Okay, just keep your doors locked, and call us if you see anything strange again." The officer repeated, and the 2 stepped out. Nathan was once again alone, overwhelmed by the events of the evening. After thoroughly locking every door in the house and checking them twice, including his bedroom door, he finally slipped into sleep, pushing aside any impulse to make sense of what just happened. Tomorrow he'd be able to think clearer. Tomorrow he would know what he should do. The next morning, Nathan woke up early, hopped out of bed, and immediately prepared to go out. "I have to get out of this house," he thought. "I feel like a day in the city will do me some good. Out here it's very quiet, and although I'm not entirely secluded, maybe I'm secluded enough that I'm not seeing things as clearly as I could. A day in the bustling city should bring me back down to earth," he mulled. The day was a bit chilly, so he decided to wear his fancier fall clothes. A bit more dressed up than he was normally, but what the hell, he would probably fit right in. And off he went. Upon arriving in downtown Lichfield, he found himself a bit disappointed. It was smaller than he had expected. A quaint little historic area, much more a town than a city. He was kind of hoping for a busy downtown area. It didn't have to be that big, but busy was what he was looking for. After a nice long walk taking in the historical vibe of the surrounding buildings, he decided to stop for lunch at a little restaurant bar that had an outdoor patio, perfect for enjoying a lunch on this gorgeous fall day. Shortly after he sat down and ordered, a tall brunette in her late 30s approached his table with a friendly smile, tilted head, and cautious steps. "Hi," she said. Do you mind if I sit with you?" she asked with a frozen grin. So caught off guard, Nathan glanced around to make sure he was certain she was talking to him. It was so forward and so rare to be approached like this by a woman Nathan didn't know what to think. But polite instinct took over, and he gestured towards the seat in front of him, nodding politely and welcoming her. "Sure," he said, his mind scrambling to figure out what possible angle this unexpected guest could be coming at. "Hi, my name is Joan," she said, extending her hand in a polite shake. "Nathan." Nathan returned, politely returning her smile as his mind raced. Hi, she said, laughing, seemingly aware this was unexpected and potentially very awkward. Nathan stared, expecting her to get to the point of her visit quickly. Could she be a saleswoman? Maybe an overly zealous churchwoman looking to spread the good news? Even call girl flashed through his mind as a possibility for her forwardness. But she wouldn't come out with it. She just began talking as if the situation wasn't strange at all. "What a nice day," she exclaimed. Nathan nodded. "Great day for a patio lunch." Nathan nodded again with a smile. The waitress asked her what she would like, but she just said, "Only water, please." "I just had to get out today," she continued, as if they were good casual friends. "I love Lichfield this time of year, but you're probably used to it." It was a statement, but Nathan got the impression it was question. "Yes, it is very nice, but this is my first time experiencing downtown Lichfield. I live outside of town about an hour away," Nathan stated. "Oh," she said, nodding her head. She took a sip of her water. "Outside of town?" she asked, seemingly wanting Nathan to elaborate. "Yes, I just moved here a few months ago. I just haven't taken the time to come downtown till now," he expounded. "Really?" Joan said, cocking her head again with the same friendly smile. But she froze in the position, as if solving a puzzle in her head. "So you're new to the area?" "Yep. I'm originally from Chicago. Lived there my whole life, but wanted to get away from, well, that level of busy, if you know what I mean." She just sat with her frozen smile. He was beginning to feel her smile was a poker face. "I'm sure you've been here before," she commented, studying Nathan's face, looking for signs he was holding information back. "Family? Friends?" she prodded. "Nope," Nathan replied plainly. "I looked up reviews online. Best quiet places to live, and Lichfield's surrounding areas came up." Nathan explained. "So you've never been here before?" she repeated, shaking her head with a hint of disappointment in her tone. "You just decided to move." She stopped, took a deep breath, forced the smile back and said, "Decided to move to Lichfield from Chicago." Nathan nodded, took an awkward sip of his beer. He dropped "possible saleswoman," and now was beginning to feel like he was being interrogated on the sly. "You?" he asked. The question stunned her, as if she forgot he could ask her questions about herself in return. She shook it off. "No. Yes. I live in Hartford." She shot back, completely disinterested in talking about herself. There was another long, uneasy moment of silence. Then she turned back towards Nathan with a bashful look. "Can I ask you something weird?" she asked, chin tucked into her neck, knowing she had passed weird a long time ago. "Sure," Nathan replied cheerfully, feeling like maybe the next question would explain this bizarre encounter. "Can I see your jacket?" she asked plainly, with her arm stretched out towards his jacket he had hung on the chair next to him. Perplexed by the request, Nathan felt himself freeze as his mind raced to make sense of this. But he broke free of his mental stun before she had to ask again. "Sure," he replied, with a visible look of confusion as he passed her his jacket. She quickly scooped up the jacket and moved immediately to the sleeves, flipping the cuffs repeatedly, examining them intently. At last, she made a heavy sigh and shook her head in defeat. She hung her head and smiled in embarrassment, still slightly shaking her head. "I have a confession," she exclaimed. Nathan felt a wave of relief. He knew the answer was finally coming. "I saw you come in here. I saw that jacket and thought you might know my sister." "Okay," Nathan said, hoping there was more than that. She shook her head again, knowing she wasn't making any sense. "My sister is missing. We haven't seen her in 5 years. She disappeared and hasn't contacted or called anyone. I know something bad happened to her. She wouldn't just disappear, but no one has found anything or heard anything. I don't think the police are even still looking," she explained. "Your sister," Nathan repeated, sympathetic to her disappearance but still having no idea how he fit into this. But Joan just continued, seemingly unaware he was looking for a connection. "We suspected her husband because he was a real piece of work, but no one could find anything. He said she just ran off with her girl after a fight, and the cops believed him because the car was gone, and her credit card got used in Charlotte a few times. But there was never any video of her, and no one has seen the car since. And now there's no hope of asking him anything. He killed himself about a year after she disappeared, so he obviously won't be any help," she continued. "Killed himself?" Nathan exclaimed, raising his eyebrows. "Yeah, they found him floating in his pool with half a head. Dramatic prick." She scowled. "In his pool?" Nathan asked, his mind returning to his pool dream. "Yeah," she stated, plainly making a gun gesture to the side of her head. Forcing Nathan recall his nightmare and overall general recent weirdness also reminded him why he was here in downtown Lichfield in the first place. He was in town to get away from the weirdness. Now the weirdness had taken the form of a woman named Joan, and Nathan found himself starting to resent her company. This was the exact opposite of what he wanted coming here. "I'm sorry about your sister," he stated, his voice business cold. "But I'm sorry. How do I?" He struggled for the question, but she knew what he was asking. "I'm sorry. It was your jacket," she responded. Again, Nathan stared at her, waiting for that comment to make sense. Her embarrassed smile returned, and she again shook her head at herself. "This is going to sound even more insane," she began. "My sister's daughter had a jacket exactly like that." "Exactly!" she exclaimed. "And it's such an odd jacket. When I saw you wearing it, I thought maybe you knew something. You know, like sometimes they find people who have been missing for years." Nathan nodded his head, finally understanding how he fit in all of this. "Just like this," he said. "It's a one-of-a-kind. Custom. Cashmere," he said in disbelief. "It was $900 10 years ago," he added. She just nodded in acknowledgement. Yes, it was exactly like that. Except there was a rip in the cuff and a wine stain in the shape of a crescent moon with 3 spots around it. My sister tried to get the stain out a few times, but the stain would not come out. So when I saw yours, I knew that wasn't her jacket." Nathan sat in silence, not knowing what to make of that. And the way she came about the jacket was so weird. One day she just showed up with it on. It was ridiculously huge. We realized it was cashmere, and we knew cashmere isn't cheap. We asked her, "Who gave this to you? Where did you get it?" And she said one night she had a dream she was playing in the backyard. She was cold and wet. She came in the house looking for her mum, but a nice old man was in her mum's bed. He gave her the jacket. She said when she woke up she still had it on. We don't know where she really got it. She swears she got it from her dream, but she loved that jacket. She wore it everywhere for months. Giant jacket that hung down to her feet. She never took it off. It was so cute. What a story, Nathan thought as he sipped his beer. So much for getting away from the weirdness, he thought. Well, he started, not knowing what else to say. Lichfield police don't have any leads? She shook her head. Lichfield isn't looking. She lived in the county, so the county police technically have the case. Neighbours? He asked, not knowing why he was still continuing the conversation. No, she only had a few neighbours, she said with a sigh. A few neighbours and a windmill. A sudden shockwave surged through Nathan's body at the mention of a windmill. He sat in sudden frozen horror as dot after dot suddenly connected in his mind. A little girl who is always looking for her jacket. His nightmares of a bloody pool. The sound of a gunshot at night. Now suddenly frozen in terror, he barely mustered the strength to ask, "A windmill?" "Yeah, she lived across the street from an old windmill," Joan mentioned casually. Still, frozen, he sat staring into nothing, as his mind raced for any reason to believe this had nothing to do with the things he had been seeing back home. Joan noticed his changed state. "What?" she asked, puzzled by the sudden seriousness in his expression. Nathan dry swallowed and put on the best poker face he could muster. "Really?" he replied as a bead of sweat collected on his forehead. "What was the name of the little girl, did you say?" He managed to ask, sipping his beer now with an unsteady hand. "Hannah," she said plainly, staring off into the past with the tone of regret. A sudden panic and sensation of drowning came over Nathan. He glanced back and forth, desperately struggling for air. "What is it?" Joan asked, looking concerned. Nathan sprung up, wanting to flee, screaming, but managed to collect himself just enough to not cause a scene. With a quick stroke, he snatched his jacket off the black wire table with every intent to immediately storm away. But the sleeve of his jacket caught a sharp, jagged notch on the table, ripping the A-hole at the cuff and jerking the table with a clatter. The bottle of steak sauce splashed the jacket as the table legs returned to the floor. In a panic now, Nathan struggled to unhook his jacket, but he didn't clear it quick enough not to notice the look on Joan's face. Her look of panicked terror matched his, but she was staring down at the jacket sleeve. He stopped and looked just long enough to realize what had her frozen in place. Right there, right on the cuff of the jacket sleeve, was a rip. Alongside the rip was a crescent moon shape surrounded by 3 spots, just as she had described not 20 minutes earlier. She glanced up at him with mouth agape, confused terror on her face. Nathan yanked with all his might, determined to rip the entire sleeve off if need be to escape this dreadful interaction. He dashed to his car and sped off, the screaming of his tires matching the state of his soul as he made his escape. That night, he went to sleep with the lights on and in his clothes. This is why no one stayed here, he thought, cursing his real estate agent, whom he suspected had an idea why this property's turnover rate was so high. "I can't take this," he thought. "I'll put the hose on the market as soon as I can." He laid in bed, watching the room, almost afraid to close his eyes. But at last, he dozed off to sleep. His eyes flipped open. The lights were on. He remembered he went to sleep with them on. He glanced at the window, but it was black. The sun wasn't up. Nathan turned to his clock. 2:30 a.m. "Why did I wake up?" he silently questioned. But then he heard it. The quiet sobbing coming from inside his room. He flashed a look and sprung up in his bed, gripped in terror. There at the foot of his bed stood little Hannah, wearing the same wet, dirty white dress. Behind her the bedroom door, although he had locked it tight, with a deadbolt to match. There it stood wide open with the dark black hallway threatening with endless possible horrors. Locked in terror, he sat waiting for something to happen. The ghostly little girl continued to sob, her dress soaking wet and matted in mud. Though she wept pitifully, frozen terror was all Nathan could return as he prayed she would just disappear. "Excuse me, mister," her voice carried like thunder. "Have you seen a fluffy brown jacket? I lost mine and can't find it." Nathan swore her lips never moved as the voice came out. "She's dead. She's dead," was all he could think as he sat there gazing on her incorporeal form. But she too just stood and stared, sobs coming from the frozen apparition. Finally, fearing he may be locked in this state with her forever, Nathan managed to sputter out loud, "Jacket?" He dared glance at his closet. The jacket, the one now stained on the sleeve. "I can try that," he thought desperately. Like a prey animal fearing for its life, Nathan inched his way out of bed, watching the apparition of the girl for any sudden movements. Slowly he opened the closet door, fumbling his hands inside to retrieve the jacket. Once in hand, with every ounce of will, Nathan inched his way forward over to the child's ghost. At last, as if jumping from a cliff, Nathan swung his arms, casting the large jacket over Hannah, hoping she would just disappear underneath it. But to his surprise, it fell over her shoulders and stayed. as if she was a normal corporal child with flesh and bone. Upon receiving the jacket, the little girl's face lit up like it was Christmas morning. Gleefully she adjusted it happy wiggle, and then turned to Nathan with and smiled. "Oh, thank you, mister," she said again, not moving her mouth. "Thank you." And with that she turned, dashed, and disappeared into the dark hallway. Once again, Nathan stood frozen in a confounded state, hoping more than anything that this encounter would be his last. She got what she wanted, he said to himself, lunging at the bedroom door to shut and lock it. He hurried back into bed, pulling the covers over him, as if they could protect. "She'll be happy now," he repeated to himself. "Isn't that how it's supposed to work? Ghosts get what they want and then leave." "Right," he repeated over and over, hoping to convince himself this was her final visit. She was happy. She got what she wanted. There again he laid eyes open, hoping someday he would be able to sleep again. The next few days were gratefully uneventful. No disturbances at night, no strange visitors in the yard. Nathan began to believe he did it. The ghost just needed a jacket. He thought, shaking his head at the oddity of it all. "I suppose it's taken care of now," he thought. But although it had been quiet, and he had not experienced anything odd for a few days, something inside him still suspected this was not over. So much so, he found himself outside poking around. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he was looking for something. On Saturday he poked around his backyard with the shovel that wasn't his, stabbing the yard randomly, suspecting, even expecting to possibly find a buried pool. And after just a few attempts, sure enough, his shovel hit concrete. It only took 15 or so minutes to uncover the unmistakable edge of a pool. Thoughts of buried victims swirled around in his mind as he imagined their bodies lying at the bottom of the now dirt-covered pool. But after a call to the realtor, who plainly told him they filled in the pool for property value reasons, he released the macabre suspicion as improbable. If the filling of the pool was public and professionally complete. Still, his suspicions continued. On Sunday, he examined the outer fence, and even investigated a couple yards into the forest behind his property, but couldn't find anything out of place. So at last he opened the shed to store the shovel, getting ready to call it quits for the day. But then, something odd caught his attention in the shed. The floor didn't match the rest of the wood. It was newer, and the way it had been installed was very amateurish. He stomped on the floor, listening for anything out of place, but it was solid. Probably doesn't mean anything, he thought as he stepped out and locked up. But the fact that so much of the strange activity revolved around this shed stuck in his mind, and he couldn't help the feeling that something about this shed was the answer to everything that had been going on. Nathan's eyes popped open, and his heart began to race. "Why did I wake up?" he asked himself as his eyes darted back and forth, but he dared not lift his head. "Not again!" he begged silently. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. The air felt thick, so thick he feared he may even have trouble breathing. "Why am I awake?" he asked again in a desperate internal voice. As if answering the unspoken question, there came a sound to his ears. It was weeping, the low, stuttering sobs of a little girl. Nathan's heart sunk, knowing what was there. He smashed his eyes closed and grit his teeth, grimacing in frustrated fear on the edge of weeping himself. Slowly he lifted his head, turning towards the foot of the bed. "Oh, God!" Nathan bellowed with self-pitying terror. Just as he feared, the little girl stood at the foot of his bed, facing him, wearing the large, puffy brown jacket he had given her just last week. But this time she had no face. "Oh, God! What? What?" Nathan bellowed in miserable desperation. Then came the pathetic little voice. "Excuse me, mister," her voice carried. "Have you seen my mom? She left and hasn't come back," she asked in a pathetic, mousy little voice that just added to the contrast terror of its source. "No, no, no," Nathan responded, burying his head back in his blankets. "Go away, go away," he cried desperately. The girl's sobbing intensified. Nathan thrashed about in his blankets, as if his fit would wave her away, but it didn't help. He heard her little footsteps coming around the bed and stopping in front of him. Gnashing his teeth, he peeked out his blanket, anticipating the horror that would greet him, but she was gone. The girl wasn't there. He snapped up, scanning the room. Was she gone? But just as the spark of hope appeared, it was quickly snuffed out by the sound of weeping. The weeping grew louder. He tried to hold his ears, but it didn't help. Nathan sprung out of bed, dashing down the stairs and into the dark foyer. Silence. But then the sound came back, as if the weeping was following him. He couldn't tell where it was coming from. He grabbed his wallet and keys and dashed out the door to his car. Once inside, he paused to take a breath, considering himself safe. But then the weeping rose up again. In desperation, he wrenched his key into the ignition, glad for the loud roaring of the engine, and sped away. At last, he happened across a Holiday Inn. The price could have been $1,000 a night. He didn't care. He just waved the desk girl on in a hurry and scurried up to his room. At once he settled in, certain that he had successfully fled his unending nightmare. But then, as if the sound was simply waiting for him to settle down and still himself, the low, barely audible sound grew in volume. Nathan cried, climbing into his bed. The weeping grew louder and louder, unaffected by his attempt to muffle it with his hands on his ears. Nathan broke. Slumping into his pillow, his voice joined along with the weeping with his own pitiful sobs. He couldn't get away. There was no hope. "I will soon join the child in death," Nathan cried in torment. The sobbing didn't stop till the first crack of dawn. Nathan at this point was too exhausted to sleep. He crawled out of bed to check out, resolved to just returning home and riding out his last strands of sanity. If he was going to die or lose his mind, he might as well do it at home, he thought. Nathan stumbled into his house, and then through to the kitchen, intent on getting a glass of water before attempting to sleep again. But as he drank, he glanced out the window and saw his suspect mocking him once again. There, in the backyard, the shed door swung open, wide, taunting him. Nathan gnashed his teeth at the sight. He had double-bolted that door, and here it stood swinging open, as if daring him to approach. A sudden wave of energy came upon Nathan as he stared through the dirty window pane. An anger rose up inside him. The sound of vengeful stomping echoed through the house as Nathan stormed into the garage, grabbing his orphaned shovel, a pry bar, and kicked through the back door. A clarity had come upon him as he marched toward his answer. That shed held the key to his torment, and it was time for it to give up its dark secret. Once inside, Nathan wasted no time prying the floorboards up and then going to work with the shovel. He had no idea how long he had been digging. At this point, it didn't even feel real. He felt as if he was watching someone else dig further and further down into the ground. A haze had come over him. He felt indifferent to ever stopping. He could dig for the rest of his life, he thought. That was... until his shovel hit something different. Something hard, but soft. He scooped around the object, and then pried it up into the light. At once his haze cleared, as a sick, sorrowful disgust took its place. A woman's shoe could be seen poking out the dirt, but not just a shoe. It had a sock as well, and the sock was not empty. In it contained flesh and bone. It was the remains of a human foot, a woman's foot, that now peeked out the cold, dark dirt. Nathan stumbled out of the musty shed, holding off the urge to puke. He placed his hands on his knees and steadied himself. He fumbled his phone open and dialed 911. "I need to report a body." "Yes." "I found a body. A dead person on my property. I'm at 4437 Willow Hill." "Oh, God." He finished, unable to continue talking. He dropped the phone. "They will find me," he said to himself. He collected himself once more. "I have to finish," he thought, but he simply couldn't. He simply couldn't bring himself to re-enter the fallacious, unlawful mausoleum. It didn't take long for the coroner's office to exhume the bodies. Nathan stood smoking a cigarette he bummed from one of the detectives. "Excuse me, sir. one of the detectives said, approaching Nathan with a pad and paper. She began to ask questions, and Nathan responded on autopilot. But he seemed to wake up when the detective asked if he knew the woman. No, Nathan replied. He-Than began to bungle through the story of him meeting the sister of a missing woman, and how he happened to have moved into her house. I suspect that's her, he finished. Almost on key, the coroners carried out a large adult body covered in a black sheet. Nathan could only assume it was the woman, the missing sister. They found a second body, the detective stated, watching his reaction. A little girl, Nathan said with a grimace of sadness. Yes. How did you know? The detective asked suspiciously. The daughter went missing as well, Nathan replied plainly. Can I ask you something? What was the little girl wearing? Was it a white dress? I'm not sure, the detective replied, scribbling. Was she last seen wearing a white dress? I don't know, Nathan replied. The reply made no sense to the detective, and she shot him a confused sneer. How did you find them? What made you tear up the shed and start digging? She shot back in a very official tone. Nathan turned to her, his face as serious as any she had ever seen. Her ghost, he shot at her directly with unambiguous intent, his tone uncaring how crazy it might sound. I've been seeing a little girl dressed in a white dress for weeks, he continued. His face distorted as if he might begin crying. Okay, she replied, not having expected that reply. She scribbled again. I called the police a couple times. Nathan finished, throwing his head back in defeated frustration. You can look it up, he added, as if his report proved his assertion. Just then the coroners carried out another body, a smaller body covered in a black sheet. Just a second, Nathan shouted, approaching the gurney. He couldn't believe he was doing it, but he had to know. He had to know if she wore the fluffy white dress he had been seeing. Sir, the police called out in protest, but Nathan pulled the tarp back before he could be stopped. What? Nathan stuttered. The face was gone, just as she looked the last time he saw her in his room. She was wearing a matted white dress, but it was neither of these that staggered him. It was what she wore over the dress. No, it can't be, Nathan cried in a panic. There she was, wearing an odd, oversized brown cashmere jacket. The jacket was covered in dirt, wrinkled and matted. Clearly it had been buried a long time ago. It can't be, Nathan hissed as he violently grabbed the sleeve. Sir, the detective cried, lunging at him to stop his frantic inspection, but it was too late. He saw the rip. He saw the stain. It's mine, he cried, staring blankly into the detective's face. She didn't know what he was talking about, but he was clearly on the brink of a breakdown. Sir, she cried, was it buried in the ground? He asked, nearly in tears. Was it in the ground? He cried again, collapsing backward onto the lawn. Was it always there? He shrieked again, his body breaking into a seizure. How could it be? The very jacket he gave her not even a week ago now wrapped her little corpse like a shroud, as if it had been on her since the day she was murdered and buried.